I suppose this may be the ultimate question for almost any long-running franchise. Preservation versus evolution. So, I'm going to do that thing I do sometimes, which is where a comment will happen often enough in a video that I'll get sick of replying to it in every time it comes up, and I'll just do a video instead. So this in some ways is a follow-up to the video I did about Harry Potter, called Harry Potter and the Heteronormative Standard, where I talked about the underrepresentation of LGBTQ people in the Harry Potter universe, given that the author has said that LGBTQ people do exist in this world. If we take that as a given, there's a severe underrepresentation. Now, there was something that came up somewhat continuously in the comments that was an interesting point, but also I think kind of missed one of the elements of something that I was going for. So I want to kind of clarify it here and address that. There were more than a few people who pointed out basically the timeline of the Harry Potter franchise, both real-world timeline and fictional timeline. So the books, the first book was published in 1997. Official story, so far as best I could tell, J.K. Rowling started writing it in 1990. The last book came out in 2007. Now, setting-wise, and when I say last book, I meant the main Harry Potter series, the 7 core books. Setting-wise, it starts, I believe, set either in 90 or 91 and runs through 97, 98. So basically, regardless of when any given entry in the book was published, it is a 90s set story. So the result of that is more than a few people took note of that, both when it was written and when it was set, and said, well, given the time frame, is it realistic for there to be noted LGBTQ characters? Because it would have been, I don't want to say less appropriate, less common, let's go with that, for anyone not identifying as cisgender heterosexual to be out, especially in a high school environment. And there's a certain validity to that. So I do want to acknowledge that that's not an invalid argument or question to ask. But for me, it doesn't fix the main problems that I have. Because for me, that argument only works if you strictly confine it to those 7 books. And, and by grandfather clause, I suppose the 8 films based off them. If you confine it to those, because if we also contribute in the fact, which I've pointed out myself before, it is a third-person restricted narrative perspective, meaning except for the prologue stuff at the beginning of every book, basically the entire thing is from Harry's point of view. It's not first-person narration, but he's the only one whose thoughts we are privy to. Everything, all the information we get as a reader is filtered through him. So if he was never aware that his classmates were LGBTQ, there's no omniscient narration to inform us of that. So I do feel that that is a valid point if you restrict it to those 7 books. The problem is the argument that I was making about representation was looking at the franchise as a whole and not restricting it to the 7 books, which is sort of where I found frustration, because I got the point that people were making, but they were narrowing the view from what I was talking about. I was like, I'm talking about this, and they kind of went, well, look at this, it's fine. But I'm like, well, yeah, you cut off the segments where it all goes wrong, so sure, it looks fine now. And by that, what I mean is, and I didn't go into as much detail about this as I could have and maybe should have. Part of my frustration with Harry Potter as a franchise is that it has, as it has gone on, J.K. Rowling has had continual opportunities to basically back up her original conviction that's, about a decade old now, that gay people exist here. But for her to continue to claim that, and yet not only in the books proper, but now in things set outside the school with new characters' perspectives, things like Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, and all of the supplementary material, meaning Pottermore, Cursed Child, etc. If there is any relationship detailed, it's always heterosexual. And there were people in the comments who would go, well, look, how do you know that people didn't come out after high school? I'm like, well, strictly speaking, we don't, not for every character we saw, but every single character who we know some degree of information about them from post the last book, if it puts them in a relationship at all, it's always heterosexual. Every single last one. They're either in a heterosexual or they're not in a relationship at all, or we just don't have the information. So that was where my frustration came in, because I didn't think that you could defend it when you look at the grander scope of the franchise, which was what I was looking at. But the reason I didn't take my hat off and go through my whole LGBTQ thing is I actually want to expand this conversation out further from that initial starting point, because it brings up the question, when we're dealing with franchises that go on for decades, how much work should be put into preserving the standards at the time it was started, or adjusting it for modern standards? And this is obviously something people get very invested in, especially when it comes to things like representation, because, it, as I myself have said, when a franchise gets really, really big and it continues to exclude, a fundamental fact of who you are, which, for a lot of LGBTQ fans of a lot of things, they find themselves continue to be excluded even as more and more and more and more characters get added. And part of the reason I'm bringing this up is because some people made reference in the comments not only to Harry Potter, but also brought up Star Wars, because I mentioned that franchise. I remember one commenter specifically was like, well, Star Wars was started in the 70s. They wouldn't have had gay characters in the 70s. And my immediate thought was, look, I wasn't saying they should have had gay characters in the original Star Wars. I'm saying the franchise is still going on. We're still getting new entries. Are we supposed to be locking off to a 1970s writing standard and acting as if that's still the time that we're existing in? I'm asking that sincerely. Is that what people think should happen? And I suppose to a certain extent, I know that some people do think that should happen, because that's often part of the argument against certain changes to a franchise. Put it back the way it was. And that's not an altogether not understandable thing, because sometimes changes that get made go really badly for any variety of reasons. Characters and stories get taken in directions that are just bad ideas. They ruin things. But it's just weird for me, the idea that something that is trying to continue to exist, and I would think trying to stay relevant in modern times, that there would be a defense for continuing to act as if it's still, in the case of something like Star Wars, 1970. In the case of something like Harry Potter, like it's still 1997. If you want your franchise to remain relevant, you kind of have to change with the times. Now, that's, and I'm sure some people will misrepresent me on this one in the comments, as they did last time. My little trick to single out all the people who left comments but without finishing the video, it worked pretty clearly. I didn't point them out in any replies, but I got to go scroll through and go, you didn't finish, you didn't finish, you didn't finish, you didn't finish. So that was nice. But Much like there, I want to clarify here that I am not saying that by updating with the times that, that means a ton more diversity and a ton of this and a ton of that if it doesn't fit. So, like, I'm trying to think of a good example for a long-running franchise. I mean, I really hesitate to praise Frank Miller because I kind of find the man to be deeply unpleasant. But you know what? It's what's coming to my head. Something like Sin City. What Sin City is intended as something very specific, and it's in a very specific vein and genre and vibe, and that vibe is men. Damaged men, and the women around them sometimes, but damaged men and the things they do. I mean, that's Sin City. That's what it is. And to take something like that, and I think the comics are still running. Well, they were last I checked. It's been a while. But those did run for quite a while. And if that started updating to reflect, a more diverse perspective for the characters who are basically the focal points of the narrators of the whole thing, that would have been a betrayal of what the thing was in the first place. But when you look at something like Star Wars, where what's the core message? Rebels fight the Empire, way of the Jedi, kind of chill, kind of zen, find your path. That's Star Wars, that and the aesthetic. So something like that, it strikes me as odd that people say, oh, and again, I do understand that any new edition of any kind can be handled poorly. Not every new edition is a good edition. It will always come down to execution, no matter what it is, whether it's a good idea or a bad idea, because you can implement a good idea poorly just as well as you can just make a bad idea worse. So it will always be a matter of execution. But like to suggest that the reason why it's okay that something like Star Wars or Harry Potter doesn't have LGBTQ characters is because when the franchise started, that sort of thing wasn't normal. That's a really weird extrapolation to me. And it's the sort of thing, like, I never thought anyone would have made that argument. But it came up continuously, like enough that I'm making this video, because like I said, the reason I do these sorts of, I don't want to say rebuttal, but response to recurrent comment videos is because it's happening often enough that I get sick of replying to the comments about it. And yeah, I never would have called that people would even be making that argument, but I don't know. Sometimes it's odd. Like, I'll get comments saying, boy, I never thought of it that way, and I find myself thinking, really? I didn't think I had an unusual perspective to that. My brain might frankly work in a vastly different way than I think it does, like in terms of how typical my thought processes are. I don't know. There's a little philosophical divergence for you. But overall, it's just odd to me to make the argument that something should never evolve. Because if all you want is the same thing, well, you have the original. Just rewatch it. If it's going to continue, it should evolve in some way, shape, or form. Otherwise, what's the point? And to sort of circle back to Harry Potter and get to the other side of that critique where people were saying, but it's set in the early 90s. It's like, well, just because something's set in a time where LGBTQ people maybe felt they couldn't be out publicly, that doesn't mean that you can't have them there, or that you can't find some way to confirm to the audience. Like, you can confirm to the audience, or at least very firmly indicate, that a character is LGBTQ, or Jewish, or Muslim, or, from a wealthy background, poor. But you can indicate all sorts of things without having a character actually say it in a way that means that information is out to all other characters that are present. So I don't quite get... I mean, I get the argument that for something like Harry Potter set in the 90s that students probably wouldn't be out, but that doesn't mean they don't exist. Again, though, restricting it just to the books, I do give it a semi-pass on the basis of we have Harry's restricted viewpoint. But, you know, I wasn't talking about just those films, just those books. I was talking about the whole franchise. And in the scope of the whole franchise, I go back to the video. Go back to that one and yeah, I stand by absolutely all of that. Like, some people flat out ask me, does that change your perspective? Well, no. The fact that it was written at a certain time and was set in a certain time doesn't change my perspective because it's still going on. We're still getting new entries. And so as we continue to get more information that it continues to still be so rigidly uninclusive, no, no, that doesn't change my opinion of why I think that's kind of crappy. I think I would give a pass to something that was set, that was written in an earlier time and is closed off within that time. I don't just mean the narrative, I mean the franchise. So, you know, one of my favorite book series ever is Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Not very diverse. There is one female character of note, and she doesn't really become interesting at all until the third book. And that's really kind of her only time to shine. She doesn't do a lot. And that, you know, from my perspective here, I'm like, boy, that's kind of a shame. But I look at when it was written and the fact that it was, you know, a closed off thing, I can go, well, would have been nice if it had been more diverse. It's not, and, you know, anyone who wants to adapt it, change it, do continuations of it, which there have been some, you know, if they want to tinker with that, fine, but, you know, the original work, that is what it is. Or, oh God, I don't know. I'm trying to think of the stuff that I read when I was young that didn't become a continually updated franchise. You know, things like that, things that were done and maybe they had a little series, had a run, but then they finished, they were closed off, and they exist strictly in their moment in time. When you have a franchise that is continuing to get new entries, it no longer exists only in the moment that it was created or the time frame in which it's set. It exists now, in the time we live now, with the standards and expectations we have now. So I would feel it kind of has to evolve. Again, the nature of that evolution is going to completely vary from franchise to franchise. There's no, you know, anything being, again, I'll go back to what I said before. I'm not saying that everything being made now must have a minimum diversity quota and this and that. No. But things should change and evolve if you're going to continue to be putting it out there, because otherwise, what are you doing? From a artistic standpoint, I mean, from a business standpoint, I know exactly what you're doing. You're buying another yacht. We'll end on that cynical note. So, yeah, just kind of wanted to follow up on some things from that video and talk in general about franchise evolution as a general concept. So, whatever your thoughts on what I've talked about here, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. There's a whole bunch of stuff you can do. There's buttons and there's links. Check them out if you feel like it. There's a Patreon down there. But remember, folks, you're the council. I just run the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned.